As of this month, the second session of the 119th Congress is halfway to the end of the session. What has the Congress accomplished so far this year for industry, and what lies ahead for the next 5 months? Today's July 2026 Government Affairs briefing will be presented by Jim Kolb, partner with Summit Strategies and NUCA's advocacy partner. Jim will discuss the Surface Transportation Bill, the reauthorization of the industry's two EPA state revolving funds, the August recess, and the September legislative rush, and his outlook for the rest of the year. Thank you for joining us today for this member-only NUCA briefing. Jim, turn the webinar over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. And appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Bob said, I'm Jim Kolb with Summit Strategies, and I'm NUCA's federal advocate here in D.C. But just wanted to quickly, before we jump into what's happening here in D.C., just thank everyone who was in town and participated in the Washington Summit. Had a good turnout of NUCA members, contractors, industry partners. We had 93 registered attendees. A lot of good meetings happened during the session. And then we also had over 100 meetings on the Hill with members of Congress, senators, congressional staff. Really, great opportunity to engage during what is a really critical time, which we'll get into, for infrastructure investment, water infrastructure, utility infrastructure, as well as surface transportation infrastructure programs, which all expire at the end of the year. So our timing being in town was really good. Since folks were here, I'd like to say it was because of NUCA, but there has been a lot of legislative activities in trying to move those various bills forward. We also were very happy and honored to be joined by Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia, who's the chairwoman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, who we received the We Dig America Award for her work as chair of that committee in negotiating the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which included water infrastructure, the SRF reauthorizations, included surface reauthorizations, in addition to a significant amount of additional infrastructure investment on top of that. She was one of the lead authors of that and is in a key position as chair of Environment and Public Works Committee to move the reauthorizations of those bills. So we were really pleased to have her join us and receive the award. We are already planning for next May. So if you didn't participate, we obviously would love to see the Washington Summit grow. Like I said, it's a great opportunity to engage your members of Congress, build those relationships with them in Washington, and then invite them out to job sites and things back home, and obviously advocate for NUCA's priorities while you're here in town. So stay tuned for more information about May 2027. So as I mentioned, the largest infrastructure bill that Congress considers, usually in every 5 years, is the Surface Transportation Reauthorization that expires on September 30th of this year. It was part of the IIJA. They had a 5-year reauthorization in there. These bills tend to be not easy to move, primarily because you have to figure out how to pay for them. With the deadline coming up, we're going to need to see Congress take some action, whether it be a full reauthorization, which we can talk about the likelihood of, or they're going to need to do an extension of federal aid, highway, and transit programs, or else they shut down on October 1. So something is going to happen here before the expiration on September 30th. Both committees are working on bills right now. The House actually reported out their version of the bill in May, and are hopeful they're going to be able to get that bill scheduled for floor consideration. Their goal initially was to try to consider it in July, but that floor scheduling was tight, so now it's looking like potentially September. But we'll see where it goes. But that bill was introduced and marked up out of committee with a bipartisan vote of 62-2. So broad support, and they actually lost the 2 votes against. One was a Democrat, one was a Republican. So bipartisan opposition too, I guess. But that is a 5-year bill. that provided overall total authorization levels of $580 billion. Of that, $474.4 billion is contract authority that comes out of the Highway Trust Fund. So that is money that would flow out on an annual basis on October 1 of every year if the legislation was to become law. I think the important part about that number, I think many people did not expect that they would authorize near that level of funding because of the IIJA's was known as advanced appropriations. So they provided basically guaranteed annual appropriations for various programs under the Federal Aid Highway and Federal Transit programs. A lot of people didn't think those would continue in the next authorization, but the committee was able to work out a negotiated deal where they incorporated those advanced appropriations, the amounts, not the actual appropriations, into the Highway Trust Fund. So, that's going to provide a level of stability and increased investment levels out of the trust fund for highway and transit programs. The bill also includes a number of provisions we were pleased to see in the bill, specifically related to work zone safety, as well as provisions to try to expedite project delivery to make sure that the dollars are being provided, move out to the market, relatively quickly and don't, drag on. As I mentioned, they were hopeful to get floor consideration for the bill in July, given kind of the crush of things that they're trying to consider, in that period before they go away for their August recess. It now looks like, that's not going to happen this week. They actually leave at the end of the week for August break, and then, we'll be back in September. So they're hopeful to try to get it moved. That said, while these bills tend to, we saw with the committee vote, they tend to pass with broad bipartisan support. There are a number of challenges with trying to move these bills. The most pressing and the biggest issue really is the fact that the Highway Trust Fund doesn't have the revenues coming into it to sustain the level of investment. That's really been the case going back to the 90s. Last increase in highway user fees that occurred was in 1993. The trust fund itself has been taking more money out than it's been bringing in since 1998, or I guess Congress has had to take action to make sure that the trust fund had enough revenue to remain sustainable, starting in 2008, 2008. And since that time, $275 billion have been transferred in. So they're going to need to fill the gap between the revenues in and the amount that they're authorizing to be spent from the trust fund. They're going to need to come up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 155 to 160 billion dollars. Still haven't seen a Congressional Budget Office score on the bill, but that's kind of the best guess in what the amount of revenues that would need to be transferred into the trust fund to be able to sustain the full investment levels. Obviously, that's not easy in the current environment with the narrow Congress and fiscal hawks and deficit pressures mounting. So that's a hurdle they'd have to overcome to move the bill. There are also a number of provisions that have drawn some opposition. There was a rail safety piece that was added to the bill that the Class 1 railroads are opposed to. There was an insurance liability issue that the trial lawyers have been ginning up opposition against. And then there's always, fights around some truck size and weight issues that were included in the bill, as well as a EV fee that was included into the bill, which, were it to become law, would be the first new revenue stream to the trust fund since, as I mentioned earlier, 1993. So, but there is opposition. Conservatives are concerned that it's a tax increase, and Democrats don't like the fact that they're going to start charging EVs for being a user of the highway. So but it's something that in a House that has basically a 2-seat majority for Republicans, one senator, or one member, has a tremendous amount of leverage to hold up legislation, get provisions removed, have amendments made in order, if the goal is to try to get a bill done. So those politically challenging issues are something that are going to have to play out when they are getting ready to head to the floor. So as I mentioned, both bodies are working on it. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee is working on a bipartisan proposal. They are a little bit handicapped right now in that they don't necessarily have an agreement on what is that authorizing level. So the House is at 474.4. The Senate, they don't have an agreement on that level yet. So that obviously makes a big difference in terms of what kind of agreement you can make, if you know what the split is, what the top line level is, what's the split between highways and transit, and a lot of things start falling in place once you have that top line agreement. So that's a challenge. They also, unlike the House, where most of the bill goes through the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, they also have Senate Commerce and Senate Banking, as well as Senate Finance, who has to come up with the money to pay for the program. They're not as far along as EPW in that making that agreement. Not that long ago, EPW Chair Shelley Moore Capito did acknowledge that it was probably likely there would be an extension at some point. She wants to keep it as a short-term extension so that they can hopefully try to get an agreement in the Senate and try to get together with the House to work out a final package, something they can consider before the end of the year. But she did acknowledge it was going to happen, and that's something House Transportation Infrastructure Committee Chair Sam Graves also acknowledged, that we're probably heading towards an extension that will carry us into the lame duck session of Congress after the election. So this is going to continue to play itself out moving forward. The other thing we're spending a lot of time on is state revolving fund, the water revolving funds. Like I mentioned, the SRF programs expire at the end of the fiscal year, just like the surface transportation programs. So we need to try to get a reauthorization in place. Now, I will say one kind of nuanced piece, kind of in the weeds. Unlike the surface transportation programs, which are funded through the Highway Trust Fund, these programs the SRF programs could continue to operate through the congressional appropriations process. So they don't necessarily shut down unless the appropriations process shuts down the highway program, because they need to extend the Highway Trust Fund, the highway user fees, and then also the key point is the expenditure authority from the Highway Trust Funds. If you have a lapse in the reauthorization for the highway programs, they shut down. That does not necessarily happen with the SRF programs if there's an appropriations in place. It's a little small for me to read, but we were really pleased. We weren't, the House had talked about trying to move an SRF bill late last year, and then surface and the water resources bill kind of overtook their ability to negotiate that. But we were really pleased to see that just last week the Senate EPW committee moved their version of the water resources bill, which is something else we support, but they included within their reauthorization of both the clean and the drinking water SRF programs. And we're also really pleased that the drinking water program was reauthorized at it starts a little bit above where we are today in terms of authorized level, but then slowly ramps up on an annual level, that authorization level. We also were pleased to see a reauthorization of the lead and drinking water grant program, as well as you can see here we have kind of a flatline reauthorization, but the clean water SRF programs was also part of that package, and and then as well as the reauthorization of the WIFIA program. So, we're really pleased to see that included in the the Senate's WRDA bill. We were hopeful that the House might look at doing something similar when they moved their WRDA bill through committee, but they weren't able to get that agreement. But we were hopeful that this sets up a conversation for later this year to, there always is a big push and strong effort to get the water resources bill done, which is a biannual water infrastructure package. Usually it's the Corps of Engineer infrastructure programs. That is a biannual exercise that they've been over the last decade really good at meeting the mark on that one. We're really hopeful, and we're happy to see EPW include it. We're hopeful that SRF can hitch a ride on that, and I think the Senate EPW including that in here kind of sets up those conversations as the House and Senate begin to work out what a final water resources infrastructure bill looks like. So as I mentioned, the authorization is one important part of what has to happen for water infrastructure investment. And unlike the highway program, which can run without an appropriations in place, the water appropriations for water infrastructure programs are vital and provide the actual annual investment level that you're going to get through those programs on an annual basis. FY27 is setting up to be somewhat challenging in that regard. First thing being that I mentioned earlier that there's conversations around the advanced appropriations for various infrastructure programs, including the SRF programs that was provided through the IIJA. This will be the first year without the guarantee that those funds will be available. I think there may be discussions to provide them for some or all of the IIJA programs, but as of right now, those funds are not there. So you're potentially looking at almost a 50% reduction in the amount of money that's been provided over the life of IIJA, at least authorized to go out to those programs. So the appropriations process is really critical to how this is going to play out this year. The House Appropriations Committee did report out its version of the Interior and Environment Bill, which includes the SRF funding. As you can see on the slide, unfortunately, both of those bills receive a reduction from the FY 26 enacted levels, which those 26 levels were below what was authorized for those programs in 26. So you're kind of seeing a significant reduction in the authorized levels. And then again, you're not having the backstop or the additional investments of the advanced appropriations being provided to those programs. And then unfortunately, we continue to see that out of the already reduced amounts that for both funds that Congress is providing earmarks for dedicated projects that come out of the amounts that they're providing for the SRF. So, even at the lower investment levels going to those programs, you're seeing, close to over 50% for drinking water and close to 50% for clean water being used for specific programs. And while those are infrastructure projects that are going to go out, the concern there is that the nature of these programs are revolving loan funds, and when you provide funding to dedicated projects, they don't recycle back into the fund and revolve to provide additional funding for other projects. So really undermines the long-term sustainability of those programs. The more that they use, the dedicated or the funds being dedicated for specific projects, which is a case we've been making, as well as a number of our partners in the water infrastructure space, that this really is impacting the long-term sustainability of these programs. Obviously, that's the House bill. It's always the low water mark when we do the annual appropriations process. The Senate is not made public their bill yet. It's not clear where they are in terms of the funding levels for these programs. They're still working out the top line number for how much they plan to spend and how they're dividing up those funds amongst various subcommittees. to write their individual appropriations bills. So need to stay tuned on that. Hopefully we'll start to get some indication soon where they're going, but just always important to keep in mind the House is kind of the low water mark for the investment levels for these programs, and we're hopeful we'll see better numbers coming out of the Senate. The other thing we're working on is, pipeline safety bills, but the key part there for us is that includes the damage prevention programs. So we've got various programs moving through committee. And in the House, we have, the House Transportation Committee reported out its version of the pipeline safety bill late last year. Has really strong damage prevention language in there that tracks a lot of what NUCA and the Common Ground Alliance have been looking for. They also need to the bill, separate bill would have to come out of the House Environment and Public Works Committee. They've always struggled to move that bill through committee, but actually today they were able to get a bipartisan bill through a markup just earlier this morning. That bill also includes damage prevention, not quite as strong as what's in the House, but we'll see how that comes together. And now, and the Senate also, reported out, or they actually approved their bill by unanimous consent earlier this year. So hopefully we're heading towards this being something like the WRDA bill, where there can be an agreement and negotiations between the House and Senate to try to work something out in the lame duck to move this legislation through the or to the president's desk by the end of the year. Obviously we're going to continue to push for strong damage prevention provisions to be included. We want to strengthen what's was in the Senate and what was in the House Environment Public Works Committee, and hopefully we'll end up somewhere closer to where the T&I committee language is. But kind of a long way to go, but this is also being teed up for the lame duck session. And, we continue to monitor. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Well, I mentioned both of these earlier. Permitting reform is something that's always on the agenda. We'll always want to try to get projects moving faster. Time is money. So the House was able to move their bill through, which we strongly supported. Things have been kind of hung up in the Senate. This is again through the EPW committee. Negotiations have been a little bit on again, off again. A lot of it has to do with the administration pulling back permits that were offered for renewable energy projects, particularly offshore wind projects that were previously, or permits had already been approved. In some cases, construction had already started. So Democrats have walked away from the table. Senator Capito, chair of the committee, she wants this to be an across the board, all the above permitting reform, not just narrowly picking out certain types of projects to move forward and be expedited while others have to go through other hoops. So hopefully, as of this week, they seem to be back on trying to come up with a package and have something they can consider in September in the Senate. I think that's something there's bipartisan agreement on. Mentioned, excuse me, I'm sorry. Water resources bill is, it's gone through the House and EPW committees. The House is likely going to be on the floor, I would assume, probably very early in September. It's not a very controversial bill necessarily, so hopefully they can get floor time to have that brought up. Less clear on the Senate whether they will actually bring it to the floor, just given all their procedural hurdles they need to go through, but they could begin to work out a final package with the House. And of course, the big question from our perspective is, are they going to be, including any SRF provisions? As I said, the Senate, including SRF in their, in their WRDA bill, I think teased this up for a conversation. and hopefully, we will see that those reauthorizations make it into whatever the final word of bill is they hope to get to the president's desk by the end of the year. Heads up, we're not going to have a webinar next next month. Congress is on recess and a lot of people are out of pocket. So just easier, to wait until September. So we have our next webinar scheduled for September 22nd at 2 p.m. So with that, happy to answer any questions folks may have.
Thanks, Jim. Let's now open the webinar to questions. You can use the chat feature to submit a question, and I'll read the question to Jim. Or if you prefer, unmute yourself, state your name and company, and ask the question directly. Remember to remute yourself after you finish. And as I look in the chat feature, we've got AI assistants reminding ourselves of their utility. Does anyone have a question for Jim?
A question, if that's right, Bob.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Jim, Jason Pemberton here. This has been really interesting. This is the first one of these that I've been able to join. So thanks for doing it, and don't mind the basement behind me. As you're talking, a lot of this is reasonably new to me, but it sounds like there's a lot of stuff that's basically big picture, long term. Like there's a system that's rolling on, and we're trying to nudge and influence the system, which I understand is kind of a big part of the role. I'm wondering, is there anything else that you think, if we could wave a magic wand and NUCA could take a big swing on something that would actually make a big difference, but it's not really on the agenda right now? Is there anything like that you're aware of?
Big swing, you talk about issues beyond what I discussed here in terms of the water infrastructure?
If we're thinking about the things that matter to NUCA, and then the things that are already in train and happening, is there anything that's not on the agenda that could actually make a big difference?
Yeah. And maybe that's, I don't know, Bob, if you have ideas on that one. I mean,
I do. So much of it, Jason, because I used to work in Congress a long time ago, so of course I followed it since then as well too. The bills that Jim's just discussed, these are the ones that sort of keep the trains running on time, and they're necessary, they're needed. Some might be somewhat archaic, but if they aren't done, then the money can't legally flow, or the programs can't legally happen. What you're asking for, and I always like how you're presenting these things because it makes you think. So it's a nice way of taking what you did for us at NUCA and turning it around. From my own perspective, we had to do something that was beyond the park to sort of change the game. It's going to come down to be private activity bonds, which is something that we've been working on for 10 years, certainly longer than I've been here. And that comes down to really a simple legislative fix, but Zach Percani and Jim can certainly talk about why that hasn't happened in the Ways and Means Committee. We have a fact sheet on it online if anyone wants to read about it. It essentially frees up billions of dollars from the private, the financial sector, as opposed to public money, which is what we're talking about here. And you would think that something that would be open to reducing the burden on taxpayer would be embraced by Congress, but for a variety of reasons, it just hasn't been. So that's my take on it, actually bringing more money into it. Jim, I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Bob, and it's something. Yeah, we are having conversations. Some of it in the context of data centers. Is this something that could help with some of the utility issues around, the concerns that you're seeing around data centers? It's always been a difficult issue. They've always insisted on having the volume caps to kind of have a regulator on these, but it's really become a limiter on how much of that private investment could actually go out to support these infrastructure projects. And the more, as Bob was talking, and I was just thinking more about your question, I think the other thing we always talk about, and frankly, something we always hear about when we get together, we heard about it at the summit, is workforce development, worker shortages. How does that feed into the immigration discussions and what's happening out there on the ground? Those are always big issues that, it seems like, any meeting kind of has that issue. People are faced with that on the ground. So, and we are tracking various things on both those issues. Just didn't have them in the presentation today, but definitely things that we are aware of and tracking.
Cool. Nice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Like it.
And the workforce development issue, as Jim said, it's immigration, which is a very contentious topic on Capitol Hill. I mean, we haven't really had a serious discussion on it. When I worked for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce 25 years ago, I mean, we were talking about it then, but even before that, the last time we had real legislation going through was 1986, 40 years ago. And for a variety of reasons, the Republicans don't want to talk about it. There's other reasons as well, too, nonpartisan, that just get in the way. And when you work in Congress, and Jim can certainly testify to this, sometimes it's easier to say absolutely nothing and do nothing because other topics have a priority. So yeah, the long-term ones need to be discussed. And Jason, that was perfect for bringing up. It comes down to our limited resources and figuring what are the ones we can actually make a difference on. And many times it turns out to be the technical legislation going through as opposed to the long-term one. But I agree, it's things that need to be brought up and reminding Congress that these issues matter to us. And honestly, Summit turns out to be probably the best avenue for us to be addressing those long-term ones. And I'm glad that we've been sort of continuing to push the private activities bond thing for the 7 years that I've been here. You got to keep reminding them. You have to keep reminding them. Jim certainly knows new faces, new people on the Hill, new champions. It's advocacy. Many times it's not within one session. It's over multiple sessions, multiple years as well too.
Mm-hmm.
My 2 cents. Are there any other questions? Hearing none, thank you everyone for your questions. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. Jim, thank you very much for your time today to present this information to our members. We would also like to thank our many national partners for their continued and very kind support of NUCA and our advocacy efforts on behalf of the American utility construction industry. The next Government Affairs webinar will be held on September 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern. Today's webinar has been recorded. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel over the next few days. And thank you for your time today to join us for this monthly industry webinar and for supporting NUCA. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.